Okay, um, let me start things off by offering a word of welcome. My name is James Galbraith. I'm a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin, and a close colleague of my friends Karen Engel and Neville Hode, who have been the organizers of this pop-up institute titled Beyond the Future of Work. And this session today is a conversation that I am going to basically moderate with one guest, a very distinguished guest, my friend, Professor Albena Azmanova of the University of Kent at Brussels, who is a social critic, a philosopher, and the author of a couple of very important books, the Scandal of Reason, which has just been reissued in a second printing, and most recently, Capitalism on Edge, from Columbia University Press. At this point, I would hold up my copy, except that I already gave it away to my daughter, took it with her to Los Angeles, but in any event, there is the Kindle version, a very compelling cover art, but an even more compelling text. This is a Zoom meeting, and so participants who are here in the room will be visible. And I guess my feeling, and Albena may, I hope, agree that you can leave your cameras on, but take your microphones off for the time being. And when we come around to a question and answer session, I'm simply going to ask you to put up your hands, and I'll recognize as many as possible and let you get in and join in on the conversation. Let's see, I think that covers the logistical elements. I want to say just a word or two more about Albena Azmanova, who I think is one of the most creative and forceful thinkers who are attempting to redefine and set a path for the way in which we can examine the problems of the society and the economy in which we live. And if I may, I'll say a few words about Capitalism on Edge, that just by quoting from one of the early reviews, and modesty prohibits that I should mention who actually wrote these words, once in a while, once in a long while, a new book challenges prevailing patterns of progressive social and economic thought in terms both deep and far-reaching, yet sufficiently and self-evidently originating from within the circles of the critical left so as potentially to prove persuasive. Capitalism on Edge is such a book. Let me begin, therefore, Albena, if I may, by just posing a question to you about, broadly speaking, about the thesis that you lay out in this book. A distinctive contribution is to provide a frame, a characterization for the phase of capitalist development into which we have entered. I would say this is moving beyond, if you like, what we commonly characterize as the neoliberal phase, and which I would tend to define essentially, but not only in negative terms in the sense that it's not an attractive characterization, but also in terms of the purpose of this phase, which was largely to negate or to destroy, to take down the previously existing institutions that had been built up in the 20th century, particularly in the West, of welfare state capitalism, and in the East of socialism as well. So the tropes of privatization, of deregulation, the attacks on unions, stagnation of wages, globalization with offshoring and the setting of workers in the globally traded environment against each other. All of these things were part of what happened in the neoliberal era. But one can say that a great deal of that agenda was, in fact, unfortunately, achieved And it leads us to to need to describe the world in which we presently live, at least those of us who live in the so-called advanced Western societies. And the phrase you use is precarity capitalism. So I'd like just to begin by asking you to tell us a bit about this concept and how you deploy it as a framework for thinking about where we are in this particular place, in this particular time. Over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Very pleased to be having this discussion with you. So let me start with where my doubts about the fate of neoliberalism started to emerge. So after the financial meltdown of about 10 years ago, there was a lot of talk about the crisis of capitalism, the terminal crisis of capitalism. A lot of talk about the rising inequality, discontent, and yet, the economy was recovering. So there was some discrepancy between the diagnosis of what was going on and the reality I was seeing around us. So my entry point was to say, well, while we have been fussing about the crisis of capitalism, capitalism has actually transformed itself, mutated into a new entity. And what is underlying all this talk about inequality, crisis of capitalism, even the very discourse, is some grievance about which we didn't have a label yet. So we were expressing in the available language of the injustice of inequality, in fact, something else. So my research led me to believe that the overarching dissatisfaction is what is putting capitalism on edge rather than over the edge, right? Because my thesis is capitalism is not in crisis. It is not facing the abyss. It is not on the edge of collapse, but it is on edge. So there is some sort of dissatisfaction even among political elites and economic elites. So what is driving that dissatisfaction is a condition that I describe as precarity. So briefly, what is this? It is not just the general precariousness of human condition. It is not the general insecurity that capitalism naturally, all modern societies have this, insecurity in them. Of course, only traditional societies are very secure, but it is a politically generated condition of economic and social uncertainty, insecurity, lack of safety, that we have the expectation of certain safety, and yet the structure of the political economy, the behavior of political authority, the nature of the job market, there are a lot of factors that together generate this condition of what I call generalized or massive precarity. And importantly, I use the term not to describe the situation of the worst off, of the precariously employed, of the poor, poorly paid workers, along the lines of what the sociologist Guy Standing called the precariat. Now, I use the term to describe a pandemic of insecurity that preceded already, the COVID pandemic. That is afflicting almost all professional groups and social classes, including highly skilled professionals who are trapped in long working hours out of financial insecurity and fear of losing it all. So I track precarity on two levels. On individual level, precarity is creating acute anxiety, which is expressed in far-right xenophobia, in increased burnout and mental health disorders. But on a collective level, precarity is the reason why our scientifically savvy, politically sophisticated societies are proving so spectacularly incapable of managing crises such as the coronavirus pandemic. And my message, the message in the book is in fact the following. As precarity has thus put capitalism on edge, we are having this opportunity, an opportunity has emerged for a radical transformation, for a swift change of policy course. A U.S. survey before the pandemic revealed that the majority of millennials reject both capitalism and socialism. The younger people are ready for a fresh alternative, even if the older generation finds it impossible to think beyond the capitalism-socialism dichotomy. So what I do in the book is to explore a path of a post-capitalist future without leaning on socialism as a blueprint. This is more or less in a nutshell my argument.
Okay, well, this brings me to a number of reflections. And one of the things I like very much about the approach is that it places the problem in a kind of time dimension in the way in which focus on inequality, which I've been working on for many, many years, simply doesn't do, because inequality is something that you measure at a particular moment. Whereas precarity is something that is rooted in a particular moment, but stretches out over one's conception of the future. And this brings me to think a little bit about a particular turning point, which is the year 1968, which I think is a very interesting one for both of us, because your origins are in Bulgaria under state socialism, and mine are in the United States at the moment of the apogee of welfare state liberalism, the peak of the period that ran from the New Deal through the Great Society, and we both grew up as critics in some degree of the period in which we were raised, but also with some appreciation of the virtues and maybe some of the ideals that underlay those periods. So this all, I think, very, very interesting. But it occurs to me that particularly at this moment, in that 1968, 69, 70, one saw in both areas a real change. First of all, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, which greatly just destroyed for most people the credibility of that model, if they had believed in it up to that point. And in the West, this was the low point of inequality. And when it was a low point of inequality, it was also the greatest point of potential upheaval socially, right? And so there was, and what happened was, over the succeeding period, when I went to college, and you could see this happening, as people became more and more anxious about their future, they became more and more adapted to and disciplined by the economic system in the way they had not been in my adolescence. So it seems to me all this it ties together in a very interesting way. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit upon how your position is in a kind of a bridge between your experiences as and effectively as a dissident in Bulgaria in the 1980s, and your position now as a social critic of living, and of course, and we're all in the West essentially, has framed your thinking about these matters.
Yes, very much so. Maybe especially the following intuition. Now, the left has always counted on this crisis to radicalize people, to the left in an anti-capitalist revolt. But in fact, what we've been seeing is that precarity, and this deep, anxious uncertainty, is making people conservative. So in order to think about a novel future, a new future, we need economic security of sort. And this is exactly what the 60s contained, or late 60s, 70s, in the West, and in the Soviet bloc and socialist countries, were marked by relative economic stability. If you read the Port Huron statement of the Students for Democratic Society, I think it was published in '68.
No, it's much earlier, actually. I think it's 62. Okay.
Right, but this expresses, the vision of the leaders of of the '60s revolution,
Sure,
people what they aspired for, and that was a certain aspiration to find a new type of society, not to tweak a little bit with redistribution, but really to go against the whole model of of existence. And that Port Huron statement opens with, "We lived in a relative economic comfort." So I believe that destabilization is actually closes the horizon of thinking. That, and in order, if we want to, we are aware of a lot that is wrong in our societies, and yet there is no impetus to transform, to find a new path. In order to create the conditions for this, we need this kind of not affluence, not consumerist affluence, but economic stability in order to let people think big. And this is what we actually had in the '80s when I was a student in Sofia University and joined the dissident movement. We lived, I could say the same, we lived in relative economic comfort. And we aspired to a project, to a form of society that would not be capitalist and would not be socialist, for some novel form. So these were very ambitious contexts, but I think the conditions of possibility for this kind of big thinking, it has to do with economic stability. So if we want to transform capitalism, we need to start fighting precarity. In fact, because precarity has much to do with jobs and work, with those two contradictions of work-related contradictions of contemporary capitalism, I think that the fate of capitalism depends on how we tackle the problem of jobs. That is one of the greatest engines of precarity for all.
That brings us right to the theme of this pop-up institute, which is about work, about the future of work, or about going beyond the future of work. It's clear one aspect of precarity capitalism that's very pronounced, particularly in recent years, is the rise of contingent labor, what we call the gig economy, what in Europe is called mini jobs, the term that's not, I think, so widely used in the United States. But in this country, the gig economy takes forms which are clearly precisely designed to evade the responsibility that employers would otherwise have had for healthcare, unemployment insurance, basically also for pensions, which are almost a lost art and a thing of the past, at least in the private sector. So let me just move along and just ask you how you see the challenge of dealing specifically with those issues. If you want to build a post-capitalist society that specifically addresses this sort of psychological, difficult to measure, easy to define, easy to understand, difficult to measure social psychological state.
Right.
Go ahead.
It is so much easier to measure inequality, right? I think that's
it's not easy, but at least it's
much easier than pinning down a number on precarity, on insecurity.
Yeah.
That's why it's easier to report, at least. And so before we address the solutions, I think we need a proper diagnosis of the problem. And this I have offered in the form of two work-related contradictions of contemporary capitalism, which I call the surplus employability and the acute job dependency. So let me briefly explain that before we start addressing the solutions. So on the one hand, the IT revolution has automated a large part of the production process and has increased productivity. That means that in principle, our societies can produce the necessities of life with very little input of labor. That's very liberating. We can all work less. John Maynard Keynes had predicted this development already in the 1930s when he described, the future as the 21st century as the age of leisure and of abundance. However, even if in theory we can work less, we're all in fact working more, aren't we? Surveys are detecting a global trend in longer hours spent in paid employment in all advanced economies. So there is this decommodifying potential of the new economy. And then there are very strong commodification pressures. This is partly to austerity policy, cuts to social spending, and cuts to wealth redistribution. So this has increased a person's need to rely on employment, on a paid job as a source of livelihood. So we need, today we can work from everywhere and at any time, and we do so. So increased competition within deregulated and open markets has increased pressures on labor from expanding working hours and working lives to the constant need for a training in order to remain employable. We are very worried about remaining employable. So we are all the time trying to maintain to remain, to keep a job, to find a job, to remain employable. And this is spilling over of work into leisure and domestic life. So this simultaneous increase of the decommodification potential of modern societies and the increase of commodification pressures to remain employed and to seek employment, is one of the key contradictions of contemporary capitalism that I have called surplus employability. That is, even as we can work less, we do work more and are perpetually honing our employability. There is another contradiction. Even as we rely increasingly on jobs for our livelihoods, the economy does not produce enough jobs, certainly not enough good jobs. This is partly due to automation, which is replacing not only routine blue-collar jobs, but also the good and stable jobs that have been the foundation of middle-class prosperity. But it is replacing also white-collar administrative jobs. Creative jobs are also being eliminated. Computers now compose music, design objects, and develop scientific hypotheses. So another factor pushing in the same direction is job outsourcing, the famous job outsourcing, which is in itself enabled by financial liberalization and the digital revolution. By the fact that in recent years, competitiveness, not just competition, but competitiveness has become the top policy priority of national governments. So competitiveness does not condition growth on employment and domestic consumption, but instead upon companies successfully competing in the global economy, deriving revenue from global markets. So that does not necessarily create jobs, in the West. So there's this hand-picked capitalists by the state, national champions that are, favorably treated by the states. And then as competition on those companies is reduced, competition for everybody else increases. So as a result of this, Western societies observe that since the 1990s, have been afflicted by a situation that is known as jobless growth, as well as jobless recovery. And I bet this is going to be very soon the case, even as currently we're experiencing labor shortages. When we get back to normal, job growth will be done most likely through insecure employment. So this condition, this contradiction or tension between the need to rely on a job as a source of livelihood and the fact that the political economy does not produce the needed jobs, I call acute job dependency. So we are all trapped in intensifying competition for fewer and fewer jobs, and not just the Uberized, precarious jobs, but even the good jobs are, there is more and more competition for them. With our free time spent on building skills for finding a job and remaining employable and employed.
I'm going to offer here a slightly discordant thought here, in which may also border on an almost grotesque caricature of the differences. The differences, I think, that maybe exist to a degree between the situation in Europe and the situation in North America, the United States in particular. That's the European problem since the 1970s has been essentially, just as you've described, a very limited number of new employments and a lot of particularly for young people, inability over long periods of time to land any kind of job at all. And then they've adapted to this by creating really what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs. The U.S. is a world of plentiful bullshit jobs and jobs that are not necessarily all bullshit either, but that reflect as you said, the fact that that people have their material needs met increasingly easily in a very highly productive society, and possibly also because of the rise of Asia as a manufacturing center for the whole world. But then their incomes go increasingly toward the provision of services of one kind or another, personal services, at all kinds of levels of let's say elegance or the opposite. But that's where all the jobs that have been created, and they've been very numerous in the last 20 or 30 years, have been of basically of this type. And they got hammered in the pandemic, but that's where the jobs were. I'm just going to suggest that this partly reflects the very different habits of life in the two regions. Europeans have a strong sense of the things that they can do outside of their job life. But if you live in the United States and you live in a suburb, then if you don't have a job, you're stuck with the crab gas and the kids and the commuting. And the job is an increasingly important piece of your identity, and it's something most of it's not heavy lifting.
Coming in Europe as well.
Yeah. So I wonder if I guess the question that I want to come to is, we have a very specific discussion of what should be done, and there are alternative proposals out there, and there are at least two that are common, and then there's the Azmanova proposal. So perhaps you could just take us to those.
Yes, right. So there's this situation of precarity around jobs. What do we do? There have been two competing strategies. Universal basic income, so make people, dislodge them from the need to depend on a job. Universal basic income, and then there's this alternative of centralized job creation. Kind of planning of job creation. Both are bad ideas. And let me briefly explain why they're both bad ideas. UBI sounds splendid. Now give it to me anytime. But with the current indebtedness of government, it would be even foolish or irresponsible to give free money to individuals rather than build up the public services, the commons. So if we are to invest in anything or spend the funds on something that should be building up the commons. As to programs of centralized job creation, on which the job guarantee, for instance, depends. On the one hand, this risks to deepen the syndrome that you mentioned, that David Graeber described as the bullshit jobs. He wrote in 2018 that half of societal work is pointless and becomes psychologically destructive when paired with work ethic that associates work with self-worth. So we should not go into that because it's also psychologically dangerous. But on the other hand, such a centralized approach to job creation is likely to bring back the bureaucratic economism of the post-war welfare state, which is also very highly problematic. We don't want to return to this. So I believe there is a way out. We need to try to tap into the promise of the new economy to free us from work. And this can be done via work time reduction and increasing voluntary employment flexibility. Increase the incentives of people holding a good job to work less and open up the labor market for the outsiders who, well, the unemployment among young people in Spain is 25%. So to allow them, job sharing. I call that, this third option, I have called the universal minimal employment. This is the most difficult one, indeed, to deploy, even if it is actually the most realistic, because it would require a reform of social security policy, of unemployment policy, to disconnect, the whole so-called social safety net, to disconnect it from the employment contract, so that people have the incentives of not working more than they would value to work. There was a recent study by the Edelman Foundation showing that about 80% of people work more than they would normally desire, but they do that out of insecurity. So we need to think of ways of building those incentives for voluntary employment flexibility.
So this was very close to the proposal that was actually put in place in France. I don't know what it was, 15 or 20 years ago, to reduce the work week to 35 hours.
35 hours.
And I wonder what your sense is of how well that worked out and how well it's been accepted in the subsequent years and what's happened to it since.
Yes, well, they gradually,
it eroded.
did away with that.
Yeah.
It eroded, and as far as I remember, actually, it had been opposed a lot by the workers, by blue-collar workers, because they felt that they needed more revenue in order to make ends meet. So of course, one needs to make sure that the income through these shared jobs is enough to provide for the essentials of life, because you cannot limit the working hours if you don't do anything else. You need to square the circles, but I'm sure that economists know how to do that.
I'll state for the record that I'm a partisan of Pavlina Cherneva's program for the job guarantee. But I don't want to get into the debate on that right now. I think it would be a very good moment, actually, to invite those who are in the room. There are over 30 participants who are here on Zoom, who are just to put up your hands and engage in the conversation and however you think best. And I believe it's possible also for those who are watching on YouTube to interject a question that will go to a unseen moderator in ways that I am not under technology, the details of which I am not privy to, but I think it works. In any event, those who are here can certainly join in at this point. Would you please do? Do we have anybody who would like to like to speak up? I can see on the guest list already quite a few people I know well and have known in past times. Perhaps a few words. I will not go so far as to actually start calling on people in Socratic fashion, even though the origins of the Pop-Up Institute are at the law school. So this would not be a completely unfamiliar procedure. Anybody want to?
May I ask a question?
Go ahead, Georgios Kostakos. Go ahead.
No, it's my name is Ricardo Bomarco.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I see Georgios up. Ricardo, go ahead.
I'm calling in from Sweden. Thank you for a very nice conversation. Interesting. I'm wondering about this with inequality. I understand your point, and I agree with you about the fixation about inequality may not be the right way to go, but precarity is definitely an important issue. But does that mean that inequality is not important? Because isn't inequality an expression of I mean, there is a lot of value also created, and that value is not well distributed, which is, as far as I understand, a basis for the precarity. Could you comment on that, please?
Right. Great question. Thank you for asking it. No, of course, inequality is problematic, but in this case, I treat it rather as a symptom. Let's think. Capitalist societies have always been unequal. Why are we suddenly, so worried about it? How come it becomes noticeable? Because normally people do not notice the inequality. Inequality is graded. It is not like you can see the 1% and then the rest are in rampant poverty. Inequality is not noticeable because it comes in degrees. People's wealth is stratified. So it is not so much noticeable in everyday life. That's why on one hand, I do not think that this is what bothers people. And I would agree with studies on philosophical arguments about poverty, the link between poverty and inequality. The poor suffer because they don't have enough, not because others have more. We can have very equal societies that are precarious and poor, right? You can imagine, for instance, socialist type of societies that we experience. Or we can have unequal societies where the essentials of life are secured and nobody is worried about poverty. So I treat the very discourse, the concern with the inequality that we actually do not see, as a symptom that something else is bothering us. And this is what I label precarity. Now, it's very important to ask another question, is when economic inequality becomes a problem. Actually, Marx treated that question. Marx was not an egalitarian. He has written in very ardent terms against wage equalization. But this is how I would answer the question. When does economic inequality become a social problem? It is when it translates into social privilege, when wealth translates into social privilege. So when economic inequality becomes social inequality, because in our society we expect at least that we are equal as as social beings.
But I don't. But isn't it a macroeconomic problem? I mean, people are worried that the inequality is the hoarding of a very, very, very few people of enormous amounts of capital, which they don't invest in things we need, which would be the theory, right? We let people get rich. So isn't that a problem. I understand your social aspect, but just a macroeconomic aspect, and then I'll shut up.
There's certainly an identity essentially between the capitalist social organization and the concentration of capital in the hands of a small group of a capitalist class. That is the nature of the beast, and the measures of inequality just reflect to a large extent the pricing of those assets. I want to make another observation though about the visibility or invisibility, which is, it seems to me that Europeans have a sense of living in much more egalitarian societies, at least within their own communities, because they do. But if you come from, as Albena does, from Bulgaria or from Romania or from Portugal, you're well aware that it's not an egalitarian continent. If you come from the south of Italy, you know that it's not. Whereas Americans are, for Americans, the visible inequalities are very much close at hand. You take a subway ride across New York City and they're in your face, or you travel from one side of Austin to another, you're going to see them in a highly visible way. So there's another difference between the geographic and social layout of the two continents, which I think worth pursuing. Let me move it along and ask Georgios Kostakis to speak up.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion and thought-provoking, and I hope we get some, not solutions, but indications on the way forward. I want to bring up two issues. One is a structural inequalities, which are really embedded either in the North-South relationship globally, when we have all these, let's say, lines of production, and everything is funneled to the West because of the strong currencies, right? The capacity to print money and everybody buys it, etc., that the South does not have. Then you have inequalities of one kind that it's not just social or whatever, it's really a reality imposed on people, and there is no possibility to get out of it. Also, we see it now in the developed world that the richer people become, the less tax they pay, the more they depend on valuations in the stock exchange, which is not necessarily tied to anything concrete that they offer or to the real economy. So these things are embedded into structures that eventually we get these extreme inequalities. And right, so I think that breaks the fabric of democratic societies, or even the resilience of societies as organized units, but also in terms of pandemics, etc. Because we see the hoarding, let's say, of vaccines in the north and the lack in the south. And another thing is, if we, let's say, we work less, who loses, and we get more or less the same, we have the same income, who loses out of this rearrangement? Is it that the whole system cannot cater for everybody? Do we need this incentivization through the push for lower salaries, etc., to be able to cover our needs? Or it would spoil the current economy as it is if we started to enjoy more, work less, and not move like crazy all around. And I want to juxtapose final thing. I think that the left and the right, in a way, have the same discourse, although they take different perspectives, that the economy is very important. What if we have as more important well-being, the environment, and a new way of politics and thinking, which for me is also the green way, the ecological way, which is not only about the environment, but it's also about the human beings and well-being. I don't know what you think of all this. Thank you.
Is your question to me?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Okay.
Both?
I agree with you. If there are structural drivers of inequality, for instance, that the losers have no chance to advance, that is unfair. But even if my point is that even if we create egalitarian societies, and I'm not against that, but even if we manage to eliminate the structural inequalities, to create completely egalitarian societies, they might not necessarily be solidaristic, because those, for instance, who work more but get less for their work would hate it. So egalitarian societies are not necessarily solidaristic. In Eastern Europe was the case, but that would not solve the problem of anxiety related to precarity. That's my appeal, to treat inequality, precarity, and poverty as three distinct problems that need specific solutions, and not to lump everything and to reduce it to inequality. For instance, if we do not invest in our healthcare system, but give everybody 140,000 euro at age 26, as Thomas Piketty prescribes, how is that going to make our societies less precarious? This is my appeal, that these are very distinct issues, and we, or through redistribution, radical redistribution, we might actually damage the engine that creates material affluence, and then actually can damage the chances of the most poor. So we need to be very careful not to create these flawed causal, causal links.
Part of the danger here, I think, lies in treating the artifact of income inequality as though it represented the social question under. And there's also quite a bit of interesting recent work, which of course makes the point that anytime you have progress of any kind, it's going to cause an increase in some form of inequality, because it has to start somewhere before it can spread. And so that was the point of Angus Deaton's work on healthcare. Makes this point very, very vividly. So while it can be a symptom of a social problem, that's not necessarily the case in all circumstances. And then when you think about what you have to do to deal with precarity, you're asking, what are the specific circumstances that cause people to live very anxious and insecure lives? Their health care, their housing, their old age security, and these things you can deal with them without necessarily having any effect on the measure of temporal inequality. So if you put everything on the household balance sheet in a current way, which is basically as the Thomas Piketty proposal, and there was a Bruce Ackerman and Elstad book some years ago that I reviewed very unfavorably that made the same point. Then you're running into some of these difficulties. I see a question about income inequality further is from Paul Toprak, I believe, unless I'm misreading the name and it's actually in Cyrillic, in which case it would be pronounced very differently. But if you would like to speak up and make your question, or I can read it from the chat.
I can go ahead and read it. I mean, basically, it's about, we're talking about angst here. Why has there been angst? Well, because we've been increasingly having rising income inequality since the 1980s, and people's is noticing it as it increases. And so I believe that's what the angst is, one of the major drivers of the angst that we are having.
But logically, on what grounds would we even make that claim, that it is income inequality that is creating the angst? For my book, I looked at the statements of the Gilets jaunes, because the French government did a very extensive study. People were talking about incapacity to make ends meet, how expensive the gasoline is for their cars, how insecure their jobs are. But there was not mention of inequality, while the pundits and the academics were writing these articles based on economic data in the academic journals and the mass media. So I'm not convinced that we can just so easily make that assertion that this is what drives the angst.
Greg Miller, you have a very well phrased question in the chat, and again, I can read it, but I invite you to let your voice be heard. Not hearing a voice, I will go ahead and read the question. Wouldn't a voluntary reduction in work hours and a reduction of forced precarity require an increased commitment to the public, to a shared world, to a collective fate? Albena, do you imagine a collective imaginary as the motivational basis which would enable people to alter their and society's self-conception as me first. Is this a version of a left populist nationalism, or is it something else?
What a wonderfully phrased comment. Collective imaginary. Well, if that collective imaginary is some sort of a utopia, like socialist utopia, a distinct sense of what kind of society we are going to need, I'm not holding my breath. I'm not seeing on the horizon any viable utopia, including the socialist utopia. Unfortunately, it has been discredited by the Soviet experience. I personally would endorse some sort of a liberal socialism, but we're talking about, tangible opportunities for change. And I think that the combination between the lack of utopia and precarity is making people, the vote at the midst of the biggest economic crisis, the vote shifted to the center left into the far left. It would be great to have a collective imaginary, but in the lack of that, where we might hope that something might happen is that the condition of precarity, because it's afflicting both the poor and the rich, the highly skilled and the low skilled, the experience of precarity is different, but this is the overarching common denominator. So I believe that they would support any policy, if we have politicians to propose them, that fight precarity, that go against precarity. And since, in my understanding, that ultimately what is driving this precarity is the intensified competitive pursuit of profit, which is the main driver of capitalism. So even inadvertently, all of these measures would gradually, subversively, help us exit from this system into something new.
I want to just offer a few thoughts on this notion of a collective imaginary and a motivational basis. I think it really gets very much to the heart of things. And it reminds me of a phrase which has a certain history in my family about private affluence and public squalor, which the elderly amongst us will remember was a phrase that stems from a book called The Affluent Society that was published in 1958. And I can't forbear to mention that it's partly dedicated to me, so it's a book that has some relevance in my life. One of the things that seems to me to addresses the problem of precarity is the creation of what are effectively collective or public cultural and living assets, the things that make that give us the pleasures and the utilities of life without necessarily implicating private incomes and private work effort in order to acquire them. And to the extent that we move in that direction and make up for this imbalance that between the public and the private, between what is socially provided and what is privately necessary, then it does seem to me that you ease the anxieties that people experience. I mean, it has to do with things as elementary as your water service and your sewage and your trash collection, and as important as your public schools, but also your parks and your libraries and your cultural opportunities. All of these things come together in a way in which seems to me that you can address you can ameliorate the feelings of precarity and anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely.
People that they
If
live
I can
insecure.
even emphasize more that point. Now, the fact that we are so worried about inequality and we hope that we will solve the problem with the transfer, with redistribution, keeps us in this focus on the individual circumstances. But we are so much dependent and fixated on individual circumstances exactly because the public is missing, because we cannot rely on the public. So we try to have more money for healthcare, for education, for whatever. So we need to build up, to cure this public squalor as rather than rely on this individual redistributive measures.
You know, and the other aspect of this is that if one thinks about ameliorating these issues strictly in neoliberal terms, you discover it doesn't work. Because what happens, and what's happening actually as we speak in the United States and certain parts, quite a few parts of the country, is that the force of providing people with necessary funds to get through the pandemic leads to an increase in concentrated asset prices, particularly land prices. And those redound to the benefit of people who already hold the land, who are necessarily in the upper tier of the income distribution. So you basically see a reproduction of the inequality there. And now I see that a hand up that would either be from Karen or from Neville. And so I will turn to them for what may be the final intervention. Go ahead. But unmute yourself first before you speak.
Okay, thank you. I think it can be from me first, and Neville might want to chime in. So I want to thank you all for a terrific and provocative discussion. And there was a part that was the book cover really promises that I feel like we haven't gotten to. So I know there's not a lot of time left, but I wonder if you could say something a bit more about the broad alliance of strange bedfellows you imagine. Because you've told us how people we wouldn't imagine to be in the same bed are experiencing hardship, but pretty different hardship. So I'd love to hear more about what that looks like.
Yes, well, I do not mean that the precarious multitude is going to rise as, you know, the proletariat. I mostly mean this, that they would support, for their particular reasons, policies that fight precarity. So very much alike. When Cal Polanyi described this counterwave against the free market, remember, he does not describe it as like a revolution from below. You know, I do not believe that precariat, you know, the multitude can do such a revolution. It is too scared. But at the time that we transition towards the welfare state, Polanyi describes it as a broad movement of the center left, the center right, the labor unions, the Catholic churches. So the political forces pushed in the same direction, and then the democratic society, or the demos, supported that. So I believe that we're at the tipping point of this kind of movement. And actually we see some signs of this emerging. The Green Deal is supported both by in Europe. European Green Deal is supported by the majority of political forces, even as it is opposed by some of the trade unions because people are afraid about their jobs. But both the center left and the center right are talking about fighting inequality. So there seems to be emerging a sort of a push by all major political forces in one direction. So I am a little bit hopeful that these different bedfellows are going to support these policies. Something else I wanted to say, I forget.
I see one final hand up, and if the moderators will, or the people in charge will give us a few extra minutes, I'll recognize Joseph Vieras for a final question. Go ahead.
I would like to mention my problem that the whole precarity seems to appear very much when the sharing economy turned to be a privately owned platform economy. And there, the non-normal way of work, the gig work, turned to be the normal way. And that process is very much accelerating since the platforms, the Googles, the Facebooks, the others, turned to be far the biggest global players of the global economy. So it turns to be the new normal, that the gig work, the precarity is the normal. And what is the normal? It's not accepted anymore. And even when the court takes the decision that Uber has to accept that gig workers are their employees, they simply say, we are not accepting it. So it turns to be, as Albena mentioned, a kind of very politicized transformation where simply the economic overwhelming power of a certain very quickly increasing minority, which during the last 1 year could increase their assets with 54%. During 1 year, 54% of the assets of above 4,000 billionaires of the world. And it's not only the assets. The problem is that they are doing everything that the gig work type of dependence turns to be the new normal. So coming back to the question, redistribution is absolutely necessary in the sense that we have to tax them. We have to take part of their assets and turn it into a public value to make, again, the healthcare, the education, and maybe not the universal basic income, the universal basic services should be delivered. Because as you said, when you are maybe forced to have a gig work, but you have that kind of services behind you, it's already going closer to the equality. So I think that in a sense, we have to restart the thinking from this point of view, how this transformation from the sharing economy of a better future was simply co-opted by the normal economic thinking, turning the biggest companies of the world, that kind of platform economies, and turning the employability into a gig work capacity of the minority of the people who still might have their work. And then we are not talking yet about the technology, and we are not talking about the political shift, which was already mentioned from the 80s. And the Soviet Union was a monster, but it created a kind of pressure, and now this pressure is missing. So the 1 or less than 1% thinks that it's just the bonanza, no stopping force. So I think that this kind of rethinking of the processes must go in a more complex way. And as you mentioned, yes, it's not only the simple distribution or redistribution of the income. It's the redistribution of the political power, of what is acceptable and what kind of redistributed roles should be supported by the taxation of the overwhelming wealth, which is a real monster and which is derailing the process.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I just would want to add one thing. We need to stop thinking about wealth as an entity to be simply distributed. We have to think more carefully about the way it is produced. And so if we believe that having a global digital public space is sort of a public good, then the public bodies need to produce that good and not leave it in the hands of private actors. And then that we pray that they are responsible and they do the right thing. So this kind of structurally important entities need to be in public hands.
Okay, well, on that note, I think I want to thank you very, very much, Albena Azmanova, for this contribution to the Pop-Up Institute on Beyond the Future of Work. I thank Karen and Neville and the staff for everybody who contributed to the organizing of this rather phenomenal online occasion. I will just wrap the thing up by just one other small quotation, again from this unattributed book review, which ends with the following: that the issue is whether the ideologues in control will succeed in fogging things up and squelching debate, which they are trying to do at this writing by imposing the intimidating optic of a new Cold War on an inconvenient economic truth, or whether they can be displaced by a new wave that understands the nature of precarity capitalism and what must be done, as Albena Azmanova has so ably set forth in Capitalism on Edge. So on that note, I think we can wrap things up, and I just want to express again my appreciation to Albena and to everybody who's participated in what I think has been a very, very helpful and useful discussion.